Journal with ghostly hand. A landlord finds her missing tenant's journal describing the surrounding woods as a sentient, observing force. When new entries begin appearing in her own handwriting, documenting her private life with terrifying accuracy, she must return to the cabin to outsmart the entity that is slowly writing her into its story. Arthur Bellow was the perfect tenant, paid on time, quiet, kept to himself. When he stopped paying rent and stopped answering his gore, I did what any landlord would do. I drove out to his cabin to see what was left. I expected a mess, maybe a skipped lease. What I found was a journal, left open on the table as if he'd just stepped out. The first entry read, "The woods are not empty. They are watching. They are learning how to be us." I dismissed it as the ramblings of a lonely man. I took the journal as evidence. That was my first mistake. My second was reading it. My third was when I woke up 2 nights ago, went to my kitchen for water, and saw the journal on my table, open to a fresh page. And in my own handwriting, it described exactly what I had just been dreaming. Now, it's writing more about my past, about my fears. It's learning me, and I think it's almost finished. Rain has a way of making the world feel smaller. It turns the windshield into a tunnel, and the road ahead is the only thing that exists. That's where my head was at on the drive to Pine Ridge Cabin. Property management isn't glamorous. It's spreadsheets, repair calls, and occasionally dealing with the aftermath when someone just vanishes. Arthur Bellow had been a model tenant for 3 years. Quiet, reclusive. His rent always appeared like clockwork on the 1st. Then, last month, nothing. No check. No response to emails or calls. After the legally required notices, the keys were mine again. My job now was inventory, damage assessment, and the beginning of the eviction process. A Tuesday errand, or so I thought. The cabin wasn't deep in the wilderness, but it was on the edge of it. The paved county road gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to a muddy, potholed track that wound through a dense stand of old-growth fir and cedar. The rain softened here, blocked by the canopy, becoming a drip, drip, drip on the car's roof. The air that came through my vent smelled of wet earth, decaying leaves, and something else. A sweet, almost cloying rot. It was quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. The cabin appeared through the trees, a simple A-frame of dark-stained wood, looking damp and forgotten. No car, no lights on inside, though it was 2 in the afternoon, and gloomier than dusk under the trees. I parked, grabbed my master key and a clipboard, and made a dash through the rain to the covered porch. The key turned smoothly. The door opened without a sound. The inside was perfectly tidy and cold, a deep, settled cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The main room was one open space, a small kitchenette, a sitting area with a stone fireplace, a desk under a window looking into the green wall of the forest. Everything was in its place. The bed in the loft was made. Dishes were washed and put away. It was as if Arthur Bellow had tidied up, stepped out for a walk, and never returned. No signs of a struggle, no note, just emptiness, sound of Riley's footsteps on wooden floorboards, the distant drip of a leak somewhere. "Hello, Mr. Bellow?" My voice was too loud in the stillness. It was just me. I started my checklist. Furniture, present, good condition. Appliances, functional. No visible damage. It was the easiest inspection I'd ever done, and it set my teeth on edge. People don't just evaporate, leaving a spotless cabin. I moved to the desk. It was the only surface with any personality. A neat stack of books on local flora and fauna. A few well-worn field guides to birds and mushrooms. And in the center of the blotter, lying open as if paused mid-thought, was a journal. A large, leather-bound thing. The cover worn soft with use. My professional brain noted it as personal property to be boxed. My curious brain saw the open page. The handwriting was small, precise, almost architectural. The date at the top was from 6 weeks ago. I leaned closer, not touching it. The entry read, Observation log number 47. The subject's mimicry has progressed beyond auditory phenomena. This morning, I observed a perfect replication of a pileated woodpecker's drumming pattern, but originating from a stand of hemlock where no suitable tree exists. The replication was flawless in rhythm, but lasted 3 minutes longer than any natural sequence. It feels less like mimicry now and more like practice. The hypothesis strengthens. The phenomenon is not residual. It is pedagogical. It is learning. I blinked. What was this? Some kind of naturalist's notes? It read like a scientist's log, but the subject was, what? The woods? I carefully turned the page back, my gloved fingers barely touching the corner. Earlier entries were similar. Log number 32. The face in the bark pattern has appeared on 7 different trees along the Western Trail since last full moon. Always the same arrangement of knots and moss. A signature or attempt at a stable form. Log number 19. Continued silence during the designated listening hours. But the feeling of being cataloged is overwhelming. Every step I take, every breath feels noted. A chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature crept up my spine. This wasn't just eccentric. This was the documented descent of a man who believed the forest around his home was alive, intelligent, and studying him. I felt a pang of pity mixed with professional unease. This was a mental health crisis, neatly written down. My protocol was clear. Secure personal effects for next of kin. I closed the journal, noticing the leather strap that bound it. I slipped it into the large evidence bag I'd brought, sealing it. It felt heavier than it looked. I finished my inspection quickly after that, the cozy cabin now feeling like a staged set. I locked up, hurried back to my car through the dripping trees, and threw the bag with the journal onto the passenger seat. I wanted to be back on paved road, back where things made sense. The drive back was quieter. The rain eased. I kept glancing at the bag on the seat. The journalist in me, the part that had gotten this job because I was good at solving practical puzzles, was nagged. What was the phenomenon? Was Arthur Bellow a crackpot, or had he stumbled onto something? That night, in my own tidy, modern apartment with its view of other apartment lights, I poured a glass of wine. The journal sat on my coffee table, still in its bag. I told myself I was cataloging it. I put on gloves again, broke the seal, and took it out. I started from the beginning. The early logs were dry, academic. He was a folklorist by trade, it seemed, collecting local tales of the whispering Pine Ridge. But his work shifted. He stopped collecting stories and started documenting interactions. He devised experiments, leaving patterned arrangements of stones, playing specific music on a speaker outdoors, recording the forest's responses. His writing grew more urgent, more convinced. He named it the Silent One or the Watcher. He believed it was a consciousness as old as the hills, a slow, vast mind that perceived humans as fleeting, fascinating ephemera. It didn't communicate. It absorbed. It learned behaviors, sounds, patterns with the infinite patience of geology. It was compelling madness. The logic was internally consistent. By the time I reached the final entry, the one I'd seen on the desk, my wine was gone and the room was dark. The final sentence sent a genuine shiver through me. The learning phase may be concluding. I fear the next stage is replication. What will it make of me? I closed the book. Enough. The man was clearly ill, lost in a delusion that cost him his lease and maybe his mind. I put the journal on a high shelf in my living room, next to a stack of design magazines, out of sight. Tomorrow, I'd start the process of finding his emergency contact. I slept fitfully. My dreams were full of slow-moving shapes in deep woods, of being watched from behind a veil of leaves. 2 days passed. Normal life. Leaky faucets. Lease renewals. A disappointing date. A journal on the shelf became part of the furniture. A sad artifact. Then, on Thursday night, I woke up thirsty. The digital clock read 3:18 a.m. The apartment was silent. I padded to the kitchen, got a glass of water, and stood drinking it in the dark living room. My eyes adjusted. The shape of the bookshelf, the silhouette of the chair, and on the coffee table, the dark rectangle. My heart gave a dull thud. That wasn't right. I always left the coffee table clear. I flipped on the lamp. The journal lay there, open, not to an old page, to a fresh, blank page at the very back. And on that page, in crisp, dark ink was a new line of writing. The handwriting wasn't Arthur Bellow's precise architect script. It was mine. I dropped the glass. It hit the area rug with a muted thud, water spreading. I didn't care. I stumbled forward, my knees hitting the edge of the table. I stared. The sentence was simple, devastating. She dreams of the shape in the trees, but she calls it a dream so she can sleep. My breath stopped. I had dreamed of shapes in the trees. Last night, a lingering image from Arthur's journal. I'd shrugged it off before my morning coffee. No one knew that. I hadn't spoken it, written it, thought of it since. My eyes darted to the shelf. The space where I'd left the journal was empty. Had I sleepwalked, taken it down, and written in it, in my sleep? But the ink was dry, cold to the touch, and the pen was still in its holder on my desk. A low, visceral fear, cold and solid, planted itself in my gut. This was impossible. I looked back at the sentence. My handwriting, but the slant was slightly off. The pressure was heavier than I used. A perfect replica with a subtle flaw, like a practiced copy. Practice. Arthur's word echoed in my head. It feels less like mimicry now and more like practice. I backed away from the table, from the journal, until my back hit the wall. The quiet of my apartment was gone, replaced by a humming, watchful silence. I looked from the open journal to the dark window, reflecting the room back at me. For a fleeting second, I didn't see my own reflection. I saw the deep, impenetrable black of the woods at night. The watcher wasn't in the cabin. It was in the book, and it had just written its first note to me. Rywie intense whisper. I didn't sleep again that night. I spent the hours between 3 a.m. and dawn, perched on the edge of my sofa, every light in the apartment blazing, staring at the journal on the coffee table, as if it were a venomous snake. The sentence, my sentence, glared up from the page. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a demonstration of reach. It knew my dream, a private, unspoken thought. As the gray morning light finally washed out the artificial glare of the lamps, a stubborn, practical anger began to push back against the fear. This was nonsense. There had to be a logical explanation. Sleep writing, carbon monoxide poisoning, a stress-induced fugue state. I was a rational person. I managed properties. I fixed problems. My first fixative impulse was to destroy it. I marched to the coffee table, snatched up the journal, and carried it into the kitchen. I didn't look at the page again. I shoved it into the stainless steel trash can, poured the dregs of last night's coffee over it, and tied the bag shut with a violent yank. I took the bag down the hall to the building's garbage chute. Listened to the satisfying whump-thump crash as it fell 8 stories into the collection bin. Gone. Problem solved. I spent the day in a wired, hypernormal state. I went to the office, processed work orders, smiled at colleagues. I didn't mention the journal. I didn't think about the sentence. I focused on the solid, real world of plumbing warranties and paint swatches. By 5 p.m., I had almost convinced myself it had been a bizarre, isolated episode. I returned home, unlocked my door, and flipped on the light. The journal lay on the entryway table, exactly where I dropped my keys. It was clean. No coffee stains, no wrinkles. The leather cover glowed dully in the lamplight. It was closed. The casual, deliberate placement was worse than finding it open. It hadn't just returned. It had made itself at home. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. The logical foundations I'd spent the day rebuilding crumbled into dust. This was not a chemical imbalance in my brain. This was an object violating the laws of physics, and it was doing it to me. I didn't touch it. I stepped around it, my heart hammering against my ribs, and went to the kitchen. I needed information, not folklore. Facts about Arthur Bellow. I poured a stiff drink and opened my laptop at the kitchen island. A deep dive into public records, university alumni databases, and obscure academic journals. Arthur Bellow, Ph.D., former professor of comparative folklore at a small liberal arts college. Published works, echoic myths, mimicry and memory in oral traditions. The Landscape as Archive, Non-Human Intelligence in Pacific Northwest Lore. He'd taken early retirement 8 years ago. No criminal record. One marriage ended by divorce 15 years prior. No children. His emergency contact was a sister in another state. He wasn't a crackpot. He was a serious, if niche, academic. A man who had devoted his life to the idea that places could hold memories, that patterns in nature could be a form of communication. His journal wasn't the ravings of a madman. It was his field research, and I was now part of the experiment. As if on cue, a soft rustle came from the living room. Not a paper rustle. The sound of a page being deliberately turned. I froze, the ice in my glass clinking softly. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to walk to the living room doorway. The journal was now open on the coffee table. A new page, a new sentence in my handwriting, the ink still looking damp. The sound of the ice reminds her of the leak in Cabin 7's bathroom faucet. Drip, drip, drip. She should have called the plumber on Tuesday. My blood ran cold. The leak in Cabin 7, a minor nagging repair issue I'd been putting off. I'd thought about it briefly in the shower this morning, annoyed with myself. Another private, fleeting thought. Captured, documented. The watcher wasn't just accessing my dreams. It was accessing my mundane thoughts, my to-do list. It was learning the boring, everyday texture of my life. The intimacy of it was worse than any monster. It was turning me into a living, breathing open book. I backed away, retreating to my bedroom. I locked the door. It was a pointless gesture, but it made me feel slightly less exposed. I spent the night in there, listening. I heard no more pages turn, but the silence itself felt attentive, a listener in the dark. The next morning, the journal was on my kitchen counter, open beside the coffee machine. No new writing, just the 2 sentences, a 1-2 punch of violation. I made coffee, my hands shaking. I had to get out. I went to work, but I couldn't concentrate. Every time my mind wandered to a private matter, a worry about my aging car, a memory of an awkward conversation, I'd flinch, imagining it appearing in that precise, copied script. After a pointless day, I drove home, dreading what I'd find. The journal was on the sofa, open to a fresh page. This time, there were 3 sentences. She worries the 2008 Honda will not pass its next inspection. The mechanic's estimate was $1,200. She hears a new rattle when idling. She regrets telling Mark about her mother's illness on the second date. It made her seem burdensome. The silence in the apartment between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. is the heaviest. I let out a choked sound. It was cataloging my anxieties, my regrets, my daily rhythms. It was building a psychological profile with the detached efficiency of a scientist. No judgment, just observation and perfect, cool recall. That's when I heard the first footprint. I was staring at the journal, paralyzed, when a soft, distinct creak came from the hallway behind me. The sound of a floorboard under pressure. The floorboard that always creaked when I stepped on it on my way to the bathroom. I spun around. The hallway was empty, but the sound, it hadn't been random. It was a replication, a replay of my own habitual sound, performed in my empty apartment. Arthur's words screened in my memory. The learning phase may be concluding. I fear the next stage is replication. It wasn't just writing about me anymore. It was starting to perform me, to mimic the auditory footprint of my life. First, my handwriting. Now, my footsteps. What was next? My voice. Panic, pure and electric, shot through me. I couldn't stay here. This wasn't a haunting. It was an assimilation. I grabbed my car keys and my purse, fleeing the apartment. I drove aimlessly for an hour, finally ending up at a brightly lit, anonymous chain diner. I sat in a booth, nursing bad coffee, surrounded by the comforting murmur of strangers. I needed a plan. Running wasn't it. The journal would find me. It was tied to me, not the apartment. I needed to understand the rules. Arthur's research was the key. I had to go back to the source, back to Pine Ridge Cabin. The entity was there, in the land. The journal was just its probe, its way of reaching out from its territory to study a new subject, to finish the collection it started with Arthur. The thought of returning to those woods, to that quiet, watchful place, made my stomach clench. But what was the alternative? To wait in my apartment until the journal started writing my future actions before I made them? Until I heard my own voice whispering back from the empty hallway? I paid for my coffee and drove home, a grim resolve hardening in my chest. The journal was on my pillow. A new entry, just one line. The diner coffee is always bitter. She adds 2 creams, but it doesn't help. It was with me. It was always with me, observing even at a distance. I didn't sleep. I packed a bag, a powerful flashlight, a knife, my digital camera, a voice recorder, and with a feeling of surreal inevitability, I packed the journal. If it was the link, I might need it. At first light, I would drive back to the cabin. I would face the woods that had consumed Arthur Bellow. I would find his research, his notes on how to break the connection, or I would become his final, completed log entry. As I zipped the bag, the hallway floorboard creaked again. Then, a second later, from the kitchen, the distinctive click hiss of my refrigerator's ice maker dispensing a load, a perfect copy of the sound that happened every 8 hours. The replication was accelerating. The watcher was practicing the soundtrack of my life. I was running out of time. Riley, in voice strained with exhaustion and grim resolve. Driving towards Pine Ridge at dawn felt less like a journey and more like a retreat. I was falling back to the source of the infection, hoping to find the antidote in the same place that had spawned the disease. The journal was in my backpack on the passenger seat. I could feel its presence like a tumor, a cold, knowing weight. Every mile that brought me closer to those trees made the air in the car feel thinner. I hadn't just packed supplies. I'd packed a theory. Arthur Bellow believed the Watcher was a collector, a student. It learned patterns, handwriting, sounds, routines, to understand the human thing it was observing. But students don't just collect data forever. They finish the thesis. They complete the project. Arthur's final fear was the next stage is replication. I believed the project's final requirement was a narrative, a completed story arc. Arthur's story had been cut short when he vanished. Maybe he refused to play his part. Now, the Watcher had a new subject, me. It was compiling my data at a terrifying speed. To be free, I couldn't just break the link. I had to end the story. I had to give the Watcher a satisfying conclusion so it would archive the file and move on. The gravel road was muddier than before, the ruts deeper from recent rain. The dense canopy swallowed the morning light, leaving the forest floor in a perpetual green-tinted twilight. The sweet rot smell was stronger, almost welcoming. I parked in the same spot, the cabin a dark shape ahead. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, just the drip, drip, drip from the leaves. I shouldered my pack, the journal inside, and walked to the cabin. My footsteps on the wet ground were the loudest thing in the world. The door was still locked, My key turned. I pushed it open. The cold inside was deeper than last time. A preserving cold. Nothing had moved. It was a museum diorama titled Vanished Folklorist. This time, I wasn't here to inspect. I was here to research. Almost invisible against the gray stone was a pattern. 7 smooth, river-worn stones arranged in a perfect circle around an 8th larger stone in the center. It was deliberate, not a casual decoration, an arrangement, an experiment. Arthur's log, leaving patterned arrangements of stones. This was one of his tests. I knelt, my heart pounding. I carefully lifted the center stone. Underneath, nestled in a shallow depression, scraped into the packed earth, was a small, zippered, waterproof case. Bingo. I carried it to the desk, unzipped it with trembling fingers. Inside were 3 black moleskin notebooks, far more worn than the leather journal. These were his true grimoires. I opened the first. Diagrams of the forest, marked with symbols. Charts of phenomena frequency correlated with moon phases. Theories scrawled in margins. And in the final pages of the 3rd book, the core of his conclusion. The watcher does not think in years, but in layers. It perceives a human life not as a narrative, but as a composite specimen. Habits, sounds, emotional signatures. It is an archivist of behaviors. Its goal is not to harm, but to possess a complete set. To have a person, it must be able to reproduce them perfectly in their environment. A perfect echo. The final stage is not mimicry, but replacement of the original with the archived copy. To avoid this, the subject must provide a narrative end, a death, a departure, a transformation. A finished story that can be cataloged as complete. The specimen must offer its own conclusion to the archive. I sat back, the notebook heavy in my hands. I was right. It wanted an ending. Arthur must have refused. He wouldn't give it the satisfaction of his final chapter. So it took him, incorporated him into itself somehow. His ultimate refusal left his story and his connection unresolved, which is why the link through the journal remained active. Searching for a new author to finish the tale. I had to write my ending, not in the journal, but here, in this place. I had to perform a conclusion so definitive that the watcher would accept it as the terminal data point and seal the collection. But what ending? A fake death? It would see through a shallow performance. It needed emotional truth. It needed an ending that resolved the core tension it had been observing in me. My loneliness, my practicality, my fear of being consumed. An idea formed, cold and clear. I would give it a tragedy, a surrender. I would offer it the one thing it wanted most, a perfect, willing subject, but in a way that broke the cycle. I took the leather journal from my pack and placed it on the desk, open to a fresh page. I took out my own pen, but I didn't write. I spoke aloud, my voice echoing slightly in the empty cabin. "I know you're listening," I said to the quiet room, to the watching woods outside the window. "You've collected his patterns. Now you're collecting mine. You want the complete set, the finished story." I waited. The drip, drip, drip outside paused for 3 seconds, then resumed. An acknowledgement. "I'll give it to you," I continued, my voice steady now. "I'll give you the ending, but not here. You observed him here. You need to observe me where I am real, at the heart of my pattern, in my home." It was a gamble. I was asking it to shift the locus of the story, to follow my narrative lead. I picked up the pen and, in my own handwriting, wrote a single line in the journal, pouring all my will into it. The story concludes where it began, in the heart of the pattern. I closed the journal, put it back in my pack, and left the cabin without looking back. I felt a change in the air as I crossed the porch. The watchfulness wasn't just coming from the trees anymore. It was moving with me. I had its attention. The drive back to the city was a blur. The journal in my backpack felt different. Not lighter, but charged, like a battery holding a captive storm. I didn't go to my apartment. I went to the one place in my life that was purely, unequivocally mine. A small, neglected rental storage unit on the edge of town. Unit 14B, a tomb of my past. Old furniture from my previous life. Boxes of my mother's things. A universe of dormant patterns. It was the most me place I could think of. A physical archive of Riley Carter. I unlocked the roll-up door and turned on the single bare bulb. The space was crammed with shrouded shapes, dust motes dancing in the weak light. I cleared a small space in the center. I took the journal out and placed it on the concrete floor. I took Arthur's third notebook from my pack and placed it beside the journal. 2 archives, his and mine. Then I began to perform my ending. I didn't speak. I acted. I took a box labeled Mom Photos and opened it. I looked at pictures of a woman I'd loved and lost, allowing the old, authentic grief to surface. Not for the watcher, but for me. I took a hammer from a toolbox, and with a sudden, violent cry that was 100% real, I smashed an old, ugly vase my ex-husband had loved. I let the frustration of the last week, the violation, the fear, fuel the destruction. I was giving it emotional truth, raw, concluding data. Finally breathing heavily, I stood over the journal. I took my pen and wrote the final entry, not as a copy, but as my true, trembling hand. This is the end of the record. The subject withdraws. The patterns cease. The archive is closed. The story is complete. I laid the pen down across the journal, a definitive full stop. I then took the heavy, wheeled toolbox and pushed it with all my strength, rolling it directly on top of the journal and Arthur's notebook, pinning them to the concrete floor. A physical termination. I stepped back. "It's over," I whispered. To the unit, to the presence I felt thickening the air between the stacked boxes. "The collection is complete. You have it all. Now let it end." I stood there in the silence of the storage unit, waiting. The air grew colder, then colder still, until my breath plumed in front of me. The single light bulb began to dim, not flicker, but dim, as if a vast hand were slowly closing around it. In the deepening gloom, I saw the journal under the toolbox move. Not a spasm, a gentle, deliberate shudder, as if something were being pulled from it. A faint, whispering sound filled the unit, not of voices, but of rustling pages, sighing wind, and fading footsteps, all layered into one. Then, with a soft final pump of displaced air, the light bulb brightened back to normal. The crushing cold vanished. The presence was gone. The silence that remained was just empty silence. The normal quiet of a dusty, forgotten place. I didn't touch the journal. I left it there, buried under the toolbox, in the tomb of my old life. I rolled the door down, locked it, and drove home. The apartment was just an apartment. No journal on the table. No creaks that weren't mine. I slept for 14 hours straight. In the days that followed, the world was blessedly normal. My thoughts were my own. The fridge made ice at its usual time. The floorboard creaked only under my foot. The entity had accepted my offered ending. It had archived the Riley Carter collection as complete and sealed it away in Unit 14B. I never went back to that storage unit. I paid the fee automatically. Let it sit there, a sealed tomb for a story that's done. Arthur Bellow's fate remains a mystery, but I understand it now. He refused to give an ending, so he became a permanent, open file in the Watcher's collection, a fate worse than vanishing. My own ending? I'm more careful with silence now. I avoid the deep woods, and I never, ever keep a journal. Some stories don't want to be told. They want to be collected, and the only way to win is to write the end yourself, and hope the archivist is satisfied.
Thank you for spending this time with us. I truly hope you enjoyed the video. Have any questions, ideas, or suggestions for future stories? Feel free to share them in the comments below. Your thoughts mean a lot to us. If this journey warmed your heart, don't forget to like the video and share it with someone who loves stories like these. And to continue exploring new tales and adventures, subscribe to Heartlight Saga. Until next time, may your days be filled with light and wonder.